All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us on this National Day of Truth and Reconciliation and to this CSSR webinar titled Relation and Resistance, Racialized Women, Religion, and Diaspora. So I'd first like to acknowledge that the land I live on, and that some of you I know also live on in Waterloo, Ontario, is situated on the Haldimand Tract. That's land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and is within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I'm very excited to have with me today Silaja Krishnamurti from St. Mary's University and Becky Lee from York University to present their new edited volume, brand new, and we're talking like hot off the press new. It came out, I think, last week or just before that, titled, like the webinar, Relation and Resistance, Racialized Women, Religion, and Diaspora. And that's published with McGill Queen's University Press. And it's also published within their Advancing Studies in Religion book series that I am happily just taken over from Christine as series editor of. So really excited. This is actually my first book out as series editors in the series. So really pumped about it. So Silaja and Becky will take about half an hour to give us a teaser of their new book or so. And then there's a few of the authors who will be presenting as well. And we'll then have another half an hour or so for Q&A with you after the presentations, with you, the audience. So that during the presentation for the first half hour, I ask that you remain muted, as usual for these webinars, but do feel free to post at any time in the chat. The chat is open. And if you have any questions, just post them at any time in the chat or an indication that you'd like to ask a question in the chat. And then once the presentations are done, I'll prompt everyone in order of posting in the chat to ask their question to the editors and authors. Okay, so without further ado, I pass it on to the two, congratulations, editors. Woo.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Becky, do you want to go ahead?
I do. Being the historian that I am, giving you some background to our volume. So, and it actually goes back to a collection of essays that Terry Wu and I published in 2016, Canadian Women Shaping Diasporic Religiosities. And that volume was born out of some real frustration over the limited course resources on underlining Canadian women's experiences in and experiences of their religious traditions. And it wasn't for the lack of scholarly analyses of North American women's participation in their religious traditions, however. Rather, it was that those analyses, even this was maybe 2009, those analyses generally tended to assume that Canadian women's experiences approximate American women's experiences, despite the significant differences between our respective settlement and religious histories. So that volume was our attempt to shift the focus, to examine the ways in which women have carried and conserved, brought forward, and transformed their cultures through religion in the specifically Canadian context. By the time we had a final draft of that manuscript, though some 7 years later, we were painfully aware that that volume had barely scratched the surface. But I think we accomplished, I'm sure we accomplished because of the volume that we're talking about today. Our hope was in publishing it, that this would encourage broader and deeper explorations of women's religiosity in the Canadian context. And I'm very proud and happy to say that the volume that Silaja is going to talk more about today is a wonderful, wonderful next volume. It's all yours, Silaja.
Okay, so thank you, Becky. I'm gonna just put my slides up here. Make sure everyone can see that. So this is our our beautiful graphic that was made by our friends at McGill Queen's University Press. And I want to just take a moment to thank Sarah and the CSSR folks and Kyla and the McGill Queen's University folks for all making this happen today. It's really great to see so many of you here. I do also want to start by talking about how important it is to acknowledge that today is a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Although I think there are lots of ways in which I would like us today to speak to that, I think it's important for us to make sure that we keep it at the forefront of the conversation that we have. As a settler, here in Mi'kma'ki, where I'm coming to you from today, I continue to learn about the ongoing harm of colonialism, about the neglect and violence of institutions that are called so-called residential schools, and I continue to learn about taking action to support Indigenous rights to territory, sovereignty, and well-being. And so before I say anything else today, I want to just take a moment to honor the Indigenous water protectors, the land defenders, the artists, and the advocates who continue to show us that another way is possible. Becky talked about where this volume came from in trying to build on some of the work that was begun with her previous volume. As we began to work together on this, we really realized that we wanted to focus on the dimensions of race and racism and migration history in thinking about women's religiosities. So as editors, we realized that we needed to understand diaspora really in conversation with the critiques of settler colonialism that we had been learning and thinking with. So this dimension isn't a focus of every chapter in the volume, but it is an overarching frame for the work that we have tried to do and something that we try to think about in the introduction to the volume. And so that's what I want to try to focus on here today, especially given the importance of this day. So I'm going to just begin by talking a bit about how the volume explores women and religion, and then I'm going to talk about diaspora and settler colonialism, and then I'll end just by introducing you to some of the chapters in the book. And then I'm going to turn it over to some of our amazing contributors. So the essays we've collected in this volume contribute to a broader conversation about women and religion. I think we're arguing that the book does that in three ways. So the book demonstrates that a deeper understanding of women's experiences of displacement, migration, race, and gender are all critical for scholars for studying religion in any way in Canada. The second thing is that we have tried to show how women engage with discourses of citizenship and multiculturalism as they shape identities for themselves within the settler colonial space of Canada. And the third way in which we think we've contributed is to try to reveal how women are conceptualizing traditions in new and transformative ways, challenging some of the prevailing assumptions about diasporic religion as something that is sort of nostalgically entrenched in the past. So women, I think many of the chapters in our volume are showing have been catalysts of change and transformation, working in relation with and in resistance to religious groups and the wider community. And that's where the title of our volume comes from, thinking about this tension of relation with and resistance to. So the volume arises from this nexus of diaspora studies and women and gender studies and religious studies. And Becky and I have both worked in various ways in the intersections of those fields. So we've approached this work as feminist scholars of religion who are interested in the intersections of these disciplines or these fields. Many of the contributors to this volume are themselves women who are part of diaspora communities, and some of the participants in this volume reflect on their own experiences in their writing. All of the contributors are located across Canada. They're connected with different histories and geographies. Explicitly or implicitly, all of the essays in this book trouble the multicultural Canadian imaginary and the prevailing narratives of diaspora in different ways. We're also really fortunate to have contributors who come from a whole array of disciplines. So this is a volume that we're situating in the field of religious studies in Canada, but we have contributors from fields of literature, history, legal studies, sociology, anthropology, political science, Indigenous studies. Our contributors, this amazing group of contributors, differ really widely in their approaches and in the kinds of data they draw on. They consider different questions around representation, around material religion, around social practice. Some of them are concerned with literary analysis and historical records. Some of them address law and policy and activism. But what we think ties these essays together is an interest in showing how women's experiences and perspectives and words matter. Religion and religiosity are gendered in important ways. The space of religious and political institutions, that space is mitigated by gender in all kinds of ways. Women exist in different relations of power than men do in these institutions. But women in religious communities might be restricted from roles in leadership, even when they might play a critical role in the administration of those same institutions. So in some communities, conversely, women are significant as spiritual and social leaders. So we have a whole wide array of the kinds of roles women might participate in structurally or institutionally. It's also important for us to think about how women's bodies carry a variety of markers of religion, from veiling to clothing styles to aesthetic practices that are connected with modesty or femininity or tradition. So in all kinds of ways in diaspora, these particular experiences mean that women who are visibly religious are also the targets of racist and xenophobic violence. So this also means that in Canada, women's bodies are often at the center of debates about religious pluralism, multiculturalism, and secularism. So I also want to just make sure that we note that as editors, we have approached the concept of women as a socially constructed and often contested category that isn't generalizable and not reducible to a set of physical characteristics. Our aim has been to look for linkages, contrast, relationships among women identified people who are navigating religious spaces and identities. And most of the contributors to this book have primarily studied cisgender women, but we've tried to take a more expansive approach to understanding what gender might mean in these religious, social, and political contexts. So working from the intersectional turn in feminist theory, our understanding of gender emphasizes its intersections with race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, and status. So the latter, by the latter, we refer to the concepts of immigration status, citizenship, Indian status, or other forms of relationship that are determined by the state. We also recognize that women's access to power and authority and their expectations about their roles, both in religious communities and in broader society, are shaped by these vectors. So while contributors, not all the contributors to this volume might locate themselves within this feminist framework, we are hoping that together and in conversation, the book demonstrates how these are at work. I also want to just say a few words to how we think about diaspora in this volume. So we began work on this volume by thinking about some of the most critical turns in diaspora theory that have really influenced us and our thinking. Starting with the work of Kachik Tolyan, who writes that diaspora is both objective and subjective. We also spent a lot of time thinking about the work of Lily Cho, who writes that diaspora is first and foremost a subjective condition marked by the contingencies of long histories of displacement and genealogies of dispossession. Building on these ideas of diaspora as both subjective and historically contingent, we're trying to think about how diasporic women's experiences of gender and religiosity shape and are shaped by relations of power, authority, and faith. Many scholars working with the concept of diaspora emphasize the notion that diasporic communities retain a nostalgia for or a desire to eventually return to a homeland. But as several of our contributors show, this is really an outmoded approach to understanding how communities form in migration and how they conceptualize their relations to home. Indeed, for some people in diaspora, such a home doesn't exist or is even unattainable. So our objective has been to draw attention to some of the ways that racialized women's religiosities and their strategies for resistance might be understood through this lens of diasporic homing on the contested cultural and political terrain of Canada. So in this light, one of the key tensions in diaspora studies has emerged around understanding migrant groups in relation to Indigenous people. And I've just highlighted a couple of quotes here from our volume, the first being from our introduction. So diaspora studies is by definition interested in social formations that move across borders and beyond nations. A problem in diaspora work is that it often takes for granted the histories of nationhood, territory, and belonging that are effaced by a narrative of diaspora groups making new homes. It is a reality that in building communities, diaspora people have occupied Indigenous land across Canada. When we brought our contributors together in 2017 for a symposium where we all had the opportunity to read and engage with each other's work, this set of questions emerged as crucial to the project we were trying to imagine together. The symposium began and ended with reflections on Chantal Fayola's call to be good relatives. And in chapter 12 of our volume, she writes that knowing how we are connected helps us understand our roles, responsibilities, and mutual obligations if we aim to be good relatives, whether our ancestors have been here for millennia, settled here in the last few hundred years, or are newcomers. So these conversations prompted a critical rethinking for us as editors about the ethical obligations of doing diaspora work in the context of ongoing settler colonialism. As scholars of religion in Canada, working in these various disciplines, working in various institutions, our responsibility begins by acknowledging that Canada is a settler state and that diaspora communities exist here on Indigenous land. But that responsibility doesn't end there. We seek to remind ourselves that state policies on the management of immigration, religious pluralism, and cultural heritage that have encouraged the development of diaspora communities in Canada are part of the same state apparatus that manages the ongoing colonization of Indigenous people. In her book, Indigenous Rights, A Guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Issues in Canada, Métis lawyer and writer Chelsea Vowell provides a nuanced perspective on racialized people and settler colonialism. So she writes, quote, like European descended people of the lower classes who were more pawns than power brokers in the early years of colonization in Canada and the United States, non-European peoples displaced by colonization in their own lands are folded into the settlement process when they arrive here, even as they are often denied equal social privileges. However, non-European migrants do not have the power to bring with them their laws and customs, which they then apply to the rest of the peoples living in Canada, no matter what some alarmists like to claim. The dominant socio-political structures in place remain European in origin, and as Indigenous peoples are well aware, they are not so easy to change. To make this kind of statement is not by any means to deny that violence, the violence and displacement that underlie many histories of migration connected with enslavement, war, and terror. We think that Vowell is pointing towards the complicated histories of trauma that underlie many experiences of migration. And she makes clear that in her view, Black people in Canada cannot be seen as settlers. The argument that she's laying out, though, is that these groups shaped by various histories of migration are in relation with Indigenous people here. They also carry the legacies of colonialism, violence, and displacement with them that have come from other parts of the world. So a few of the contributors to this book, particularly Chantal Fayola and Ken Derry, are attempting to think through these relations in their chapters. But as researchers, we believe that we must all continue to think about how this shapes our understandings of diaspora and migration in Canada. So I'm going to end just by saying a few words about the contributors, other contributors to this book. And I'm just going to show you from our proofs the table of contents. So the book is organized into 3 sections, and the first section introduces readers to some of the ways that women in diaspora have worked to create spaces for themselves and for their communities in Canada. The chapters are methodologically distinct, but together they offer a diversity of theoretical and disciplinary perspectives on women and religion. So my own study of women in diaspora community religiosities looks beyond mainstream community spaces and practices to think about women who may not feel at home at all in such spaces. And I won't say more about my own chapter now, but I'm happy to talk more about that later. Ken is going to talk about his chapter later as well, so I will leave it to him to provide an introduction to that. I'll just say briefly that Kari Takagaki's chapter argues that some scholars have suggested that Japanese women in diaspora played significant roles in religious community in the first half of the 20th century. But that assumption ignores some mitigating factors in Japan and in Canada, and the space that immigrant Japanese women negotiated for themselves in Canada prior to this 21st century. Shifting forward to the 21st century, Julie Vig analyzes how Sikh women in contemporary Montreal position themselves in relation to discourses on gender equality that are generated within their Sikh tradition, as well as in the ongoing debates over the place of religious symbols in Quebec's public spaces. In the second section of the book, contributors address the transnational relationships, groups, institutions, and roles in women's experiences of religion. Chapters by Nadia Hassan, Lina Samuel, Henry Shu, and Preet Verdi examine some of the transnational networks in which women have participated from the early 20th century into the present moment. And Lina is going to say a few words about her chapter as well. I will just say that in each of these chapters, the role and value of women within the community is connected with the performance of piety or traditional religiosity. So these chapters complicate these two conventional narratives about diaspora. The first, that diaspora groups are inherently conservative and traditionalist. And the second, that gains made by these women in communities are always attributable to immersion in Canada or to Canadian Western liberalism. In the final group of essays, our contributors encourage us to think about diasporic futures. So if the earlier chapters are problematizing the notion of diasporas as always backward looking, in this section, contributors look at how traditional and ancestral religious practices are part of the future of women's solidarities with each other. So this section begins with Andrea Davis's analysis of Jamaican Canadian writer Nalo Hopkinson's novel Brown Girl in the Ring, in which Hopkinson imagines a near future, a post-apocalyptic Toronto as a subversive city saturated by the stories of racialized migrants and their spiritual practices. In her contribution, Rima Burns-McGowan shows the centrality of religion in young women's mobilizations at the forefront of social change in Canada. She views diaspora as a space of connections that force one to think deeply about home and belonging. Drawing upon the voices of numerous young Muslim women, Burns-McGowan demonstrates how their experiences of racism, Islamophobia, settler colonialism, and social injustice in Canada have helped them to understand and empathize with others who are marginalized. And our volume closes with Chantal Fiola's chapter. Chantal invites us as scholars of contemporary religion to think critically about diaspora religion on Indigenous land. Fiola suggests that some aspects of diaspora theory may be useful for thinking about Indigenous communities, but cautions us against subsuming Indigenous experiences of displacement into the discourse of diaspora without thinking through relationships with land. Instead, Fiola argues for a decolonizing approach to diaspora, decentering the state and thinking through diaspora from the perspective of nation-to-nation relations. Recounting histories of pre-colonial relationships between Indigenous nations and of colonial treaties intended to build relations between Indigenous and colonial nations, Fiola conceptualizes Indigenous communities and diaspora groups as existing in relational sovereignty. So this framework emphasizes resistance to the Canadian state as the manager of colonization, immigration, and settlement. So I will close just by suggesting that Fiola's essay opens up a critical space for thinking through how we understand diaspora relations in the context of settler colonialism. And we just want to encourage all readers of this book, and hoping everyone is going to read it, to really think about this critical intervention in their study of women, religion, and diaspora. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Ken, who I think is going to say a few words about about his chapter.
Hi, Silaja. Nice to see you. I wasn't going to do slides, and then I thought it was safer to do slides because otherwise I'll talk too much. And so I feel like this is what teaching too, like the slides constrain me in helpful ways, I think. And despite the fact that I've been teaching online for 1.5 years, I still struggle with this. So yeah, I'll try and do this relatively quickly and coherently. So yeah, this is just a sort of tip of the slide to today. And then also I have in one of my courses, there's an Indigenous woman and we've started to build a connection, and she's been really wonderful. And she sent me a couple of photos in relationship to today and some conversations we had in class last week about residential schools. And she very graciously and enthusiastically said that I could share them. And so I'm going to do that first before I talk about my chapter. It's all I won't talk about these photos too much, but it's all connected in obvious ways.
What do you want?
So yeah, so that's her son. That's at the base of the Ryerson statue. Apparently when they got, so as you I'm sure all know, after bodies started to be found at schools, particularly initially with Kamloops, these kinds of memorials cropped up around the country, many of them at Catholic institutions. So this is at the statue of Ryerson at what is now called University X. And so when they got to the statue, her son took his shoes off immediately and put them there. So his shoes are apparently the ones in gray there with the green sort of insides by the flowers. So she sent me that, which I thought was really lovely of her. And then can you go to the next slide, Sarah? This is the student herself expressing her own views towards colonialism and Ryerson. So thanks. And then the next slide. This is so odd to ask somebody to advance my slides. Thank you so much, Sarah. So that's just the chapter. Next. So these are the two books that I'm looking at. I picked these books partly because I know them. These are books that I'm really familiar with, but they're crucial, I think, in many conversations around Indigenous women in Canada. These are both written by Métis authors. They became foundational for a kind of renaissance of Indigenous literature in Canada that has been dominated by women, in fact. Half-Breed came out in the 70s, and then April Raintree about 10 years later. Next slide, please. And thinking through these books and trying to do so in as responsibly as possible, given my own gender and ethnicity, I tried to make as much use of Indigenous women scholars and other Indigenous scholars as possible. This is sort of, for me, a key person. Joanna Piscanu, Métis literature scholar, who also does a lot of stuff with politics, which you can see from the title of her book here. So this became a kind of theoretical anchor point, I think, in some ways for me, and sort of how I end my chapter. Next slide, please. So very kind of simplistically, I guess, maybe thinking about diaspora in two ways, ways that other people have come up with. This is all new territory for me, so to speak. I didn't mean a pun there. In thinking about sort of and how to think about these texts and other issues. So one kind of diaspora that I think is what we most often talk about is spatial, where people are dispossessed from or removed in some way from their homeland, where they're voluntarily or they're sort of pushed out. What's complicating and sort of especially traumatizing in the case of Indigenous people is that they're still here on their land, but it is not their land, and the land's been transfigured in many ways. And so Eigenbrod, her point here is that it's a sort of re-traumatizing on a daily basis. This sort of reminder of their displacement because of the proximity to the physical space of their home. Next slide, please. And then this term, ideological diaspora, Neil McLeod, this is how he frames this kind of diaspora as alienation from one's stories. So this is a whole other kind of diaspora. And these two are obviously tied together in many ways for most communities, but I think maybe especially for Indigenous communities. So it's not just a separation, but a sort of destruction and devaluation of tradition and culture. and spirituality. And in Canada, for example, you know, in the sort of colonial history here, and in many, or perhaps all colonial histories, that's all tied with shame. So making people feel badly about themselves and their history and their ancestors. And gender becomes sort of an additional factor here, where women in these communities are particularly devalued. And these, I should make a point here, the spatial and ideological diaspora are both kinds of diaspora that these books address in different ways. Next slide, please, Sarah. So how religion figures through all of this, again, in a very kind of quick, simplistic way. So Christianity is the bad guy here, particularly colonial Christianity, in that it facilitates both kinds of diasporas, and also specifically is gendered in the way it does this. So it, again, particularly targets Indigenous women. Then we have stories as spirit, that as medicine that can harm or heal people. So I'll get to what that means in a second. And then Indigenous tradition. So these sort of three types of religion, I mean, to say it in a very odd way, all appear in the books in similar but also somewhat different ways. And then next slide, please, Sarah. So this is kind of their response. So in both of their stories in different ways, I mean, these are two Métis authors. They're both Métis in different ways, but they both are critical of colonial Christianity, although they don't essentialize the religion as negative at all, really, actually. And the characters in these books, the way the books end, they sort of end in a kind of future-looking way, but it's the beginning of a future. So at the end of their stories, that's when they start to reconnect with Indigenous traditions, or in the case of Culleton's character, April Raintree, connect kind of for the first time with Indigenous traditions, as well as Indigenous community, and also specifically Indigenous women. They begin to tell new stories, and the books themselves become examples of the kinds of new stories that they are telling. And this is all sort of, you know, in the sense of, or, you know, with the aim of, or the sort of job of creating home. So the sense that there is no kind of recovery of home as it was. So home is a process of creating and constantly recreating. And then next slide, please. This is the last slide. So this is the final quote in the chapter, which comes from Joanne Episcanu, where she says, I think in a much better way, all the things that I ended up kind of coming towards and working through these issues in both of these books. And that's it. Thanks very much. And thanks again, Sarah. And also, thank you so much to Silaja and Becky for inviting me to be part of this. I'm like more proud of being part of this project than I think anything that I have done. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. I mean, it's so great to have you here, and great to hear from you about your work. So I think Lina is going to speak for a few minutes now as well. Hi, Lina.
Hi, thank you. I want to begin by just thanking again Becky and Silaja for inviting me to be part of this project. And it's been a long road, but it's nice to see the book at the end. So the chapter that I write focuses on the Syrian Malabar Christian diaspora in Canada, and the paper is grounded in interviews that I did for my dissertation. So I draw on 64 face-to-face interviews from individuals in the Greater Toronto area. And so the paper gives insight into the experiences of one diasporic community. And the Syrian Malabar Christian diaspora, all of the respondents trace their origin to the state of Kerala, in India. And as I write, you know, they're a unique group. Scholars, as scholars point out, they're well placed in the caste hierarchy, and early conversions came from Brahmin families and other upper caste Hindu families. And so the respondents in the study are connected to a wide range of Syrian Malabar Christian groups. So I examine the role of the church in migration and settlement experiences of these individuals. What role did the church play in the migration story? And I also examined the way in which faith and devotion to the church is maintained, and also how it is challenged intergenerationally between the different generational groups. So for immigrant communities, individual identity and the collective conscience of the group are very much dependent upon being engaged with, participating in communities of practice, in this case, the Syrian Malabar Church. So scholars as well point out that historically, religious institutions were among the most important resources that immigrants had when they entered into a new space. It enabled them to reproduce their ethno-religious identities in new surroundings, and it helped them to adjust to all of the challenges in being in a new place. And so for diaspora communities, religious institutions are one of the central institutions by which immigrant groups define themselves and how they maintain their cultural and ethnic life. And as I also point out in the chapter, that these are not just spaces of worship, but they're also places where immigrants are going to receive a great deal of support, social networks in all sorts of ways that help with the settlement process. So for the respondents in my group, they're not just unique in terms of their connection to the Syrian Malabar Christian Church, but as well through the fact that the majority of the early immigrants, the first cohort, were all connected to a single labor group. They were nurses. And so the group I label as my first cohort, they were predominantly nurses, and they played a very important role in the construction of these early church communities. And so for these first generation families, the church was an important source of comfort, an important source of community, and they played a central role in bringing priests over and setting up early spaces of worship. Now, the second generation, which were their children over the age of 18 that I spoke to, they were more critical in terms of looking at their experiences within their churches that they grew up in. For the most part, when they reflected on their past, they remembered it fondly. They enjoyed the friendships that they had, the celebrations and so on. But as they've grown up and becoming young adults, they are more critical of the conservatism, the patriarchal tendencies of the church, and the lack of support that they felt at the time of my interviews. And so many of them in that group only really attended services at Christmas and Easter. And much of the tension also begins at the time where they start dating, or where they're thinking about marriage partners and feeling a sense of disconnect and support from their church community. Now, the final cohort is my third cohort, and they are new immigrants. They're coming after the 1990s, and they are not just coming from India, but they're coming from Malaysia, South Africa, all sorts of different spaces, various Middle Eastern countries. And they were more religiously conservative. Being part of the Syrian Orthodox community was a very central, important part of their own identity in a way that wasn't reflective of the previous, the second generation cohort, the young adults. So the new cohort, very active in the church community, and they're sort of making up the gap with the disappearance of that second generation group. And so we see a slow changing in membership, given the declining participation, as I mentioned, of the second generation cohort, and as well, the ways in which aging has also reduced the participation of that first generation, who are, over the age of 65, over the age of 70. So the chapter outlines that historical shift, and it also ends with looking at what are some of the challenges within this community and some of the struggles. And so I speak to the fact that, one, they need to work on retaining and attracting youth members. They need to address some of the critiques that are coming from young adults in terms of the conservatism, the patriarchal nature of the church. And finally, and this is probably the most pressing, is they need to establish elder care communities for its aging members. So the latter, as I mentioned, is a pressing issue for that first generation, as many of them have retired, and there is a pressing need for elder care within this community. And so they've really broken that or shattered the myth of our children are going to take care of us when we're older, and they're finding that no, their children are not taking care of them. And so the church has an important role to play in taking care of these first generation immigrants who played such a central role in the establishment of these diasporic communities. So that's sort of what the chapter focuses on, one sort of element of that project. So I'll end it here.
Thank you so much, Lina. Sarah, do we want to just turn to questions now?
Yeah. If the presentations are done, thanks everyone. That was really great teaser. Super excited about the book now. So if anyone has any questions, you can either just raise your virtual hand, or if your video is on, your actual hand, or post in the chat. And we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. And while you're kind of coming up and thinking, mulling over your questions, just to mention, I put in the chat at the start of the session, or close to the start of the session, the link to where you can order the book and a discount code for 20% off. So yeah, go get that book. And I'll put it again in a few minutes, just so everyone can see it again in the chat. So it's there. But is there any questions so far? Okay, I've got a question. So maybe we could start us off. So this is really fascinating stuff, and really kind of, it's not exactly what I'm working on or my specialty, but kind of seeing some links and some things I've been thinking about over the last kind of few months. You know, I work a lot on numbers, on religion numbers, and how some of those numbers are on the decline, right? So we see a lot of decline in participation in organized religion among certain demographics, right? Like, so especially the white settler populations of European descent in Canada, but also in some other demographics like certain members of second generation immigration in the country. But where we don't see it as much is amongst many women of color, right? Their religiosity levels, like if you're measuring it in like the traditional just participation in religious services, traditional measures of it, those still remain quite high amongst many groups, especially amongst many groups of women of color. And so I was thinking through maybe some of the implications of that in this kind of new shifting landscape that we're dealing with, right? It's almost like, whereas in the past, the religiosity might have been shared between different demographics, different groups, this is almost like making women of color more distinct in a way in the religiosity now, compared to, say, especially, like I say again, your white settler populations in the country. And so have you thought through that kind of shift? Is it having an impact? Is it kind of, intersectionality is almost like even stronger now in that sense, as it's more of a unique characteristic, not quite, but it's getting there. I don't know, have any of you kind of thought through that, maybe seen some of the implications of that in terms of either kind of the way they're interacting with settler populations or with Christianity or with like the majority in our society?
Maybe I could try to answer that question, but I want to see if any of our other contributors or if anyone else wants to jump in before I do. Anyone want to say anything?
I could offer a preliminary response. Silaja, hi everyone. Andrea Davis. I could offer a preliminary response in relationship to women who are racialized as Black in Canada, and that is a huge category. So when I use Black in this sense, I'm largely thinking about women who are the descendants of the formerly enslaved, who live and have lived in the Americas, in other parts of the Americas probably before arriving in Canada, but who are linked through the history and memory of chattel slavery. And I think what is important to remember there is that religion has always played an important political function within Black communities, both in terms of historically resisting enslavement and offering an alternative narrative of of self-proclamation, self-identity, and self-understanding that was philosophically at odds with the ways in which Black and African peoples were constructed as non-human, as not worthy of salvation, as outside of civilization, and so on. So that even though, Black communities, for the most part, are practicing some form of Christianity, this Christianity has always somehow kind of stood on the margins of kind of mainstream Christianity. This is why, Black churches get burnt down all the time, because they're not really seen as part of the mainstream tradition, and because they serve this important kind of resistive but also political function. If we think about the major political movements of the 20th century, within Black communities, most of them were informed and undergirded by some kind of spiritual tradition, whether it was the Baptist Church, as in the case of the Civil Rights Movement, or the Nation of Islam initially for Malcolm X. And even in the contemporary period, in societies in which Black people and Black communities live in antagonism with the mainstream culture, at work, at school, in the street, in their daily walking, living, and thinking, the church often becomes a place of safety and refuge. So that even today, the church, the Christian church, is still remains one of the most segregated institutions in North America, where Black people, for the most part, even in Canada, go to something called a Black church that is primarily made up of members either of their ethnic or national, group communities, or Black people more widely, and white people still tend, for the most part, to go to churches where they make up a majority. So I think that when we think about religion in relationship to Black communities and spirituality, which is aligned but separate, these are really complex positions that are spiritual, but they're also social, they're economic, and they're political, I think, more than anything else. Spiritual, absolutely, but also political, economic, and social, if that helps to answer. And I can only speak from that perspective.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Does anyone else want to respond to that? I would just add, I think, Andrea, what you have just said is so important and so rich. And I would just add that even thinking about how critical it is to reconceptualize how we think of Christianity in the Canadian context as not just being normatively white, but in fact having all of this complexity means also really thinking about, given this day, thinking about the role of the Catholic Church and other Christian communities in participating in the harms that have taken place in Indigenous communities across the country. So, really sort of pushing against the idea of imagining Christianity as being conventional or normative, but in fact thinking through how it has been both a site of resistance and an important space of relation, to tie it back to our volume as well.
So maybe just to follow up to maybe clarify my question a bit. So if Christianity is declining amongst, again, that kind of white settler population of European descent, does that open that space more for that, more of that discussion and potentiality to come through now that it's not maybe as normative amongst that majority population anymore? Or is the dynamic still the same? It's I guess that was kind of what I was wondering.
I mean,
the direction I was
think,
wondering.
I feel like my response to that, Sarah, would be that conversation has already been happening in communities of color, right? And so maybe it's something that we're paying more attention to as a field in terms of religious studies in Canada. But I think if you look at what's happening in Black Canadian studies, if you look at what's happening in Asian studies or ethnic studies areas, those conversations about how religion and race have intersected in these historical patterns of migration have been ongoing for quite a long time. So I think it's maybe it's just saying it's time for religious studies to pay more attention to these dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, thoughts? No, like Ken, I'm feeling like I'm teaching a class. Do any of the other contributors want to speak?
No, Sebastian? Sebastian?
Hi. Do you want to speak, Sebastian? No?
Do you have a question in the chat though?
Oh, okay.
Sebastian, we can come back to you if you'd like. Give me a moment here. Just saying that up. Shabana, did you want to ask your question? So the
question was about advice incorporating this text into teaching. I think as we've been working on the volume, I've really been imagining using this book in my course on gender and religion. I think it's a really great fit for the way that I think about how I teach that course. But it also seems to me that various chapters in this book could be used in many different kinds of configurations of coursework, thinking about religious diversity in Canada, thinking about different ethno-racial communities in Canada. I think that there are lots of possibilities there. And I also think the multidisciplinarity of the volume, the fact that we have chapters like Andrea's amazing chapter and Ken's chapter, which focus on literature. We have data-driven qualitative research like Lina's chapter, that we have historical analyses. So I think that there are lots of disciplinary connections that could be made as well.
Okay, and Shana also has a question. Shana, would you like to ask it out loud?
I can, but I'm happy for you to read it. I'd love to hear more about how the concepts or the experiences of resistance and relation, sort of what you found about that in women's experience, how they overlapped in various chapters or examples from the work.
I think that's a great question. I would love to hear from some of our contributors about how they think those things are at work in their chapters, if anyone feels like talking. The ideas of relation resistance. Ken?
I'm trying so hard to not talk. It's one of the things I like about Zoom is that I can mute myself easily. I mean, all I would say is just, I mean, that's kind of the whole point of the two texts that I looked at, was that resistance kind of is relation, or at least certain kinds of relation that they document in their texts, the ways in which certain colonial relationships kind of poison them and their sort of their spirit. And then establishing new relationships with themselves and with others becomes a form of resistance, just because, just even in affirmation, I mean, in ways that are kind of very similar, I think, to what Andrea was talking about. But without that, I mean, neither of these characters, there's no indigenous church. So the church for them is only kind of harmful. And so their way out of that is to start to build new relations outside of those networks, and with new spiritualities, or old spiritualities that they're reconnecting with, or connecting with for the first time.
Maybe I could add a little more. Just thinking of Rima Burns McGowan's chapter, in that she does it's a wonderful. She looks at young and how young Muslim women, and this is relation and resistance, like in Canadian context, in more so in the politics of Canada, I guess. And it's that they're they within their faith tradition and their sense of identity as Muslim Canadian young women, she basically demonstrates and illustrates how, in fact, these young women are at the forefront of social activism, Canadian social activism, like social activism in Canada, that instead of being that stereotype, the stereotype of Muslim hijab wearing women and girls as being somehow constrained and emblematic of a resistant and rigid kind of patriarchal reality, that in fact they challenge Canada and are Canadians in Canada and are at the forefront of change, of social change. So it's a really wonderful, kind of turn on your head these stereotypes that still pervade our culture.
Okay, any last questions or comments before we wrap up? Is everyone good? All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. That was really fascinating, really important discussion, I think, to have, and a book to have in the field of religious studies. Just wanted to jump in. So we're the CSSR, we're running webinars. We tend to run them about once a month. I don't think the details for the next webinar are quite hammered out yet, but Ziana, I know you're organizing that. I don't know if you're there. Did you want to jump in and say a few words potentially about the next webinar that will probably take place somewhere at the end of October or November? Ziana? No? Okay. Anyways, so stay tuned for that. We'll send, once we figured it out, we'll send all the info the same way that we sent the info for this one. But anyways, for today, I'd like to again thank you to the two editors here today, Silaja and Becky. Thank you so much. It's a great book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. Again, in the chat, link, discount code, if you want to go and purchase the book. And yeah, looking forward to hearing more about it in the conferences, hopefully coming in the next year or so. And yeah, having keeping the discussion going and pushing our knowledge forward on this. Okay, and thank you to the authors who are here today who talked about the book. So thanks, everyone. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. No worries.
Yes.
You all have a nice end of day and eventual weekend. And we'll hopefully see you all back in a month or so for the next webinar. Yeah.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.